This podcast is brought to you by Tāmaki Paengahira, Auckland War Memorial Museum.
It's a cold Wednesday night. You're pulling on a bib with your position stitched in bold across the front. Centre, goal attack, wing defence. Warming up, getting ready for the starting whistle, sussing out the competition. This is a pretty familiar ritual here in Aotearoa. Whether it's school or with mates after work, it's a ritual as ingrained as pavlova at Christmas. Netball is a given in New Zealand. Most of us have probably seen a game, if not played it ourselves. So how did we get here? And what can netball tell us about who we are as a nation? Kia ora, I'm Laura Skerritt, your host for this episode of The AMP, the podcast from Auckland Museum that amplifies the incredible stories from our collections, our mahi, and our place in the Pacific. In this episode, we trace the rise of netball in Aotearoa, from school playgrounds to World Cup stadiums, and explore how the game became a space for strength, sisterhood, and social change. But how do you start a 100-year national phenomenon? To figure that out, let's get a picture of what life was like for women when it all began, from the museum's social history curator, Jane Grofsky.
For women and girls in the late 19th century and the early 20th century. For example, school was compulsory from 1877 on, and that was due to the Education Act of 1877, which made it mandatory for Pākehā children to attend some form of school. And then later in 1894, that became compulsory for Māori as well. So by the early 20th century, children generally had some level of education, though secondary school attendance for girls didn't really become common into the 20th century. And then in terms of jobs, women in paid employment, it was the exception rather than the rule in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. So for example, in 1891, less than a quarter of the workforce was women. And there were certain industries like education that had a majority female workforce. So, most teachers were women, but then almost all of them would leave their jobs once they got married. And it just meant that middle-class women were instead very active in charity work, so usually through their church or through temperance groups like the WCTU, the Women's Christian Temperance Union. And that was really seen as something that you could do alongside, your main job of being a wife and a mother, as a way to give back to and to improve society. But obviously lots of women had this kind of ambition and interest and want to really contribute to society beyond that, and that's why they found themselves very active in these kinds of unpaid roles.
Nurturing your family and community didn't leave a lot of time to go against the grain and be a trailblazing woman in sport. Sports for women looked very different in the 19th century. It wasn't about competition, it was about polite recreation. Think about the main depiction of women in a period drama, taking a turn about the room, playing the piano, quietly reading or doing needlework. Women might swim, ride horses, or take part in gentle games like croquet, but nothing was formal and certainly nothing was strenuous. One influential voice was Dr. Edward Clarke. In 1874, he wrote a book claiming that women needed to slow down physically when studying, especially during their periods. His ideas, framed as science, were used to discourage women from doing sport for many years. But reality told another story. Women were already showing that they could be both strong and intelligent. Still, old beliefs meant that competitive sport was largely off limits, and a lot of women missed out on the teamwork, skills, and confidence it could bring. That was about to change, though. A new game was on the horizon, one that would put women on the court, give them a ball, and let them compete for the very first time.
I think for women at the start of netball, in its inception, it was quite liberating for women to develop a game of their own, to not be competing with boys or to be doing something that was seen as a lesser version of the sport. And there was also that opportunity for social connection and the fact that it was fairly accessible as an activity. It didn't need lots of equipment and you just needed a ball and a couple of hoops.
If you've ever looked at a basketball hoop and thought, hang on, that's not much of a basket, you'd be right. But when the game first began back in 1891, the name made perfect sense because players were literally throwing balls into baskets. classroom waste paper baskets to be precise, and every time a point was scored, the game was stopped, a ladder pulled out, and the ball retrieved. Now, maybe you've got older relatives who sometimes say basketball when they mean netball. They're not actually getting it wrong. Well, sort of. The reason that when they're showing you those grainy photos of their school basketball team, they're wearing gym tunics and not Air Jordans is because up until 1970, netball was known as basketball. The game netball that we play today traces its origins to the United States, where school teacher James Naismith first slam dunked a ball into a basket. Well, maybe the slam dunk came later, but the sport did start out as basketball in 1891 at the YMCA College for Young Men.
It all evolved from one game, which was basketball. James Naismith was looking for a game that would keep his young men fit and not injured in the off-season of American football. And so it was a game to, get that high fitness up, have the ball skills, but not risk the same level of injury. And it was a pretty fast-flowing game, bouncing the ball. And women saw the game being played, obviously YWCA and YMCA are very closely linked, and so some women came from women's colleges, saw it being played and thought this would be ideal for our girls.
That's netball historian Dr. Margaret Henley.
There were some English women there on the sideline, and they thought, this will be good to take back to England. And so they said, how do you sort of organise it? And they said, we sort of have three areas. You have your attackers, your defenders and your centres. And by the time it got through to England, they thought that meant that you had 3/3 and they were absolute, so nobody could cross those thirds. And then they thought, we can't have the women dying of apoplexy from running around too much.
So, in the late 19th century, women in England began playing a version of basketball modified to align with social expectations of the time. No dribbling, minimal running, and certainly no physical contact. For a long time, it was a commonly held belief that a Presbyterian minister, the Reverend J.C. Jameson, was the first to bring basketball to New Zealand in 1906. But hold up, that's not the whole story. In fact, this tale starts a few years earlier, and with a woman. Her name was Jessie Knapp. Jessie's talent shone from a young age, earning her scholarships that led to Nelson College for Girls. There, under the wing of trailblazer Kate Edgar, New Zealand's first woman with a university degree, Jessie thrived. She tackled subjects from languages to mathematics, history to mental science, and by 1891 she'd earned her Bachelor of Arts. As our curator Jane Grofsky said earlier, teaching was one of the few careers open to women at the time, but Jessie used it as a launchpad. She began in primary schools in Nelson and Palmerston North before moving to the Girls' College in Whanganui in 1898, and that's where she introduced her students to something new: basketball. The first mention of her efforts comes in the school's 1898 annual report, a good 8 years before the Reverend Jameson was thought to have seen the first coin tossed on the game. The weather had been against them, it said, but the next year there was a shift in tone.
Basketball, which went through a somewhat sickly infancy last year, developed into quite a lusty youth under the good nursing of Miss Knapp.
So how did a teacher in Whanganui learn about a women's version of basketball when the original game had only just been invented in the United States? Well, by the late 1890s, women's newspaper columns were already buzzing about this new game for girls. They called it football played with the hands, and some even printed rule books and simple court diagrams. It was sweeping the United States, and already part of teacher training in England. Jessie was exactly the kind of woman to seize on an idea like this: sporty, well-read, and willing to give her students something fresh and exciting. And from these early games in her schoolyard, basketball and later netball started to take root in New Zealand.
It was played on spaces that were not required for male sport. That's why it ended up where it was, if you think about it. That it used to be on playing fields, but that's required by men and boys during winter for rugby and whatever else they needed pieces of dirt for. So they slowly got moved and squashed off there. And so the only place that males do not require for their sporting endeavours is the tennis court in winter. and you just repaint the lines, and so that became space that the netball increasingly went into, because it was unwanted space for male sport. And of course girls' schools had hugely less land and acreage than male sports had, and from when they were built, when they were purchased. Because girls were assumed not to need to run around so much.
Despite societal expectations, these women were using their resourcefulness and determination to literally take up space and pursue their passions. This kind of make-do attitude saw the game evolve differently as each community saw fit.
So in New Zealand we started playing, we was playing 7-a-side, and the private girls' schools were playing 7-a-side, but we were playing mainly 9-a-side, because that was the way that all girls could get a go, because they had such a restricted number of courts that they could play on. Because there's only 2 tennis courts, that was all they could manage. And so they do 9-a-side because that got 18 girls through in a game instead of 14 girls through in a game. And so it was very much to do with meeting local conditions, local needs, and just adapting and evolving.
With local centres adapting the game for their regions, the sport quickly garnered a following of loyal players. While they could, anyway.
They loved it. They were obsessed by it. And of course women, adult women, had a very small window within which they could play. They played through primary and secondary school, but then, the average girl left school at 15. Maybe some made it to 16, the brainy ones made it to 16, some left at 13, 14. But if they left at 15, 16 as the average, and then they were out in the workforce, and then they married round about 19, 20, 21 years of age, that's the only time they had of being independent young women. And that's when they played their game, because the moment you were married, you didn't play anymore, because A, that would be selfish, and B, that would take out all of your energies, which should be going into supporting your husband and servicing the needs of your children. So they all stopped playing as soon as they were married. Those were the rules. Those were the unspoken expectations of society.
Even those still allowed to play weren't exempt from the pressures of polite society. Though already confined to a third of the court, there couldn't be room for anyone to play too boldly.
We can't have women hogging the ball, which you can do in basketball, because women are not there to be stars, they are there to foster esprit de corps, right? So that you are a team and you only play as a team, and the team can only win because the team work together to win. And they also wanted to get more play in the centre. If you think about it, basketball, like the middle of the court is a corridor for basketball, because it's all the starry stuff just around the headboards, around the hoops at each end. That's where all the magic is. But netball, there's a lot of game in the centre of the court, huge amount of game in how you get the ball through the court. So it slowed down the game. And by having those 3/3, and we developed our 9-a-side game, and they were limited to their thirds, so that slowed the game a bit more as well. And originally they could actually hit it from one end down to the other and cut out the centre third, and so they went, that means all the girls in the middle won't get to touch the ball. We can't have that, and it's also unladylike doing the big heave-ho, so they stopped that, and so you had to play in each of the thirds.
But limiting the amount of cross-court lobbing had an unintended outcome. Far from making the game gentler and safer for the delicate wee ladies giving it a go, these rules entrenched a strategy and speed that separates netball from other team sports today. By the 1920s, a strong community had evolved around netball, and there was a growing feeling that, to take the game further, the netballers of Aotearoa had to band together. Netball had spread across the nation, but one town's netball could look pretty different to the games played a town over. There was a clear need for a national body to set the rules once and for all.
So the women who were running the game in the growing provincial areas, particularly in Auckland and Wellington and Christchurch and Dunedin and Invercargill was strong too. And they said, we've got to pull together and we've got to get this game so we're all codified and we're playing the same game so that we can play each other, and we can't have a national tournament because everybody's playing a different game, so we need to decide on what we're going to do, and the only way we can do that is to form an association. So that's what they pulled together and did in 1924, which made us the first netball playing nation in the world to form an association.
The sport was formalised under the New Zealand Basketball Association, a name it would keep for nearly half a century.
The formation of the association in 1924, that was a far-sighted, bold move, and it was also a move to make the sport the national sport. They were hell-bent on making it the national sport because hockey had been the national sport for women up till then, but of course that competed with male needs, recreational needs. So by 1927 it was the national sport. It was the one that nearly all young women played.
From city courts to remote rural schools, netball became a staple of community life. It was a game that didn't need much. A ball, a court, some chalk lines, and a lot of enthusiasm. So by the mid-1920s, we'd nationalised the game. But what about internationally?
When we played Australia for the first time ever in 1938, which was to try and get some international competition, we had to play a 7-a-side game when we only played a 9-a-side game when we went over there, and we got beaten horribly because it was very different. They played on grass courts more because they had more room than we did, because we were used to playing on asphalt courts and 9-a-side. It was a very strategically different game. And then our lot didn't want to change in Australia, weren't going to change for anyone, and so we didn't change until 1959. So it was a long time before we actually went across to the 7-a-side game.
The Commonwealth has always been a strong centre for netball, and that rivalry between New Zealand and Australia goes back to the very start. You know, our first international tournament was against Australia, and so that rivalry has actually just been there from the very beginning and right the way through.
When women started playing netball socially, the aim was to encourage them to be physically active, but it became so much more than that.
We had the first wave of feminism, which was obviously the suffragists, and all about the vote and education and health and employment for women. And so that early push came through. So in the 1920s, this group of women who brought in these changes and started to build and push from there, they're what I call the silent feminists. And these were middle-class women, usually educated middle-class women, who started to be hugely involved in organisations out of the home. So they still were married, raised their families and did all of that, but they had a pretty good workable knowledge and position within society, and sometimes entrepreneurial. Their husbands were, often quite entrepreneurial, so they understood about those things. And they started to go into all of these associations and started to make change. And they fervently believed that through sport and all of the benefits that sport bring for women, which is about health, about well-being, about friendship, about loyalty, and about supporting one another, enriched women's lives. And it also meant that their lives were going to be different from that of their mothers and their grandmothers. And so they wanted to bring about change and progress in women's lives. So each generation of young New Zealand women coming through were going to have better quality of life, better chance of education, better chance of recreation, which is what netball, basketball was able to give them. So they're a fundamentally really important group of women who sort of laid that foundation, and they were tireless. It was all a huge volunteer army, basically.
As the game evolved to reflect changing attitudes towards women's physicality, so did the players' uniforms. Fashions which may appear dated and constrictive to a modern eye were integral to this wider process of liberation.
Well, when we look at the uniforms, I think it really it reflects how the game itself has changed and grown. Because in its inception, the intention was to have this sport for women that allowed them to essentially maintain their decorum. And so you didn't have to hunch over like you did with hockey, and you'd stop to pass the ball and not get too sweaty. But obviously, you get the players themselves on the court. And they want to play and they want to exceed, and so they push it to become this very fast-paced and physical game that it is today, and that's why the clothing has evolved to allow for that.
In the early days, players had to dress modestly. Picture long, heavy skirts with woolen box tunics that reach well below your knees, wool stockings, bustles and button-up shoes.
Uniforms today, I mean, all sports uniforms more or less are made of synthetic technical fabrics and that have been made to be lightweight and to be flexible and to comfortable. And then when you look at the early 20th century, I mean, this was before the widespread development of synthetic fibres, so it was cotton and wool and things like that that really featured heavily. So if you look at the first national team in 1938 when we were touring Australia, they've got this posed team photo and they're all wearing a black woolen tunic over a long-sleeved white cotton shirt, and they've got a tie done up. And you look at the photo and you think, oh, that's their formal uniform, and they'll take off the tie and roll up their sleeves to play, but when they get on the court. But no, that was the full playing uniform. And today, you know, we look at that, we think, oh, it looks very constrictive and quite over the top. But actually that gym tunic at the time, it was a very freeing garment because it allowed for a wide range of mobility, and it could fit any shape of woman, any size of woman. And it stayed the uniform in professional and in school domestic netball for much of the 20th century. A lot of our mums will probably remember that ubiquitous gym tunic. But then by the 1970s, there was a two-piece style of uniform that started to become more common, and that was when you had the polo shirt and the pleated wrap skirt that was held on by Velcro. Though that was a bit risky. In the 1979 World Cup, Silver Ferns captain Lynn Parker actually had her skirt ripped off during the game, so there was a bit of a hazard. And then finally in 1999, that's when you get the Silver Ferns switching to the iconic sleeveless polyester black dress, and that's more or less been the style for the past 26 years for the team, and it just gets periodically updated.
What players wear today is a further evolution of that all-in-one get-up, but made with breathable and durable fabrics, often with moisture-wicking properties, to help players stay cool and dry. Plus, you could just biff it in the washing machine and not have to worry about cleaning your heavy woolen tunic. One less chore, score. Off the international stage, netball is just as popular on local courts. Here in New Zealand, children can start playing netball from the age of 5 right up until they leave school, and it's consistently the most popular sport played. Young people across the country are learning about teamwork, communication, and perseverance. It's a game that teaches so much more than just throwing and catching. It's about developing friendships that last a lifetime, about learning to trust your teammates, and about the thrill of a hard-fought win. We caught up with junior netball team, the Lightning, from Codylands Primary School to find out what they love about their game.
Hi, my name's Tilly, and my favourite thing about netball is shooting. My name's Kaya, and I like netball because there's a lot of action in it.
My name's Daniel. My favourite thing is when you get like a intercept and they're just like, how did you get that?
My name is Edie, and netball is not just for little girls, it's for all ages and all genders. Anyone can play it. It's insanely fun.
Once you leave school, social netball is there to fill the gap, with thousands of players up and down the country joining teams and competing in community leagues.
Hi, my name's Annabelle Walker, and I'm in an indoor netball team called Howdy Hoops and an outdoor netball team called Shoot Happens. It was to meet new people, and I really enjoyed playing in high school, and when I moved in with my flatmate, we were both really interested in meeting new people and just doing something together, and we thought we could rally in all our other friends to play in a team together, and that worked really well because now I'm in 2 different teams, and they're both quite different, but I like that because I'm meeting new people every week. Since I played it my whole life during school and then had a big break in between uni and work, now doing it socially this year, I just remembered why I love it so much.
Netball is one of the most inclusive sports out there. Whether you're indoors or outdoors, young or old, competitive or just in it for the laughs, there's a place for you on the court. You'll find women's teams, men's teams, mixed teams, social clubs, leagues, walking netball, and as of 2025, No Limits Netball, created to bring disabled players off the sidelines and onto the court. Last year, in partnership with Netball New Zealand, Auckland Museum celebrated the sports centenary with the exhibition Our Game, A Century of Netball in Aotearoa, New Zealand. 1 year on, we're taking the opportunity to keep the story going.
So we have a rugby museum, a cricket museum, often sort of smaller affairs, but also without really having netball specific museum or a national sports museum like they do in Australia, based out of the MCG in Melbourne, there was quite a need to celebrate 100 years by actually showing off some of that collection somewhere. So it was nice for us to be a venue to tell that story for a kind of, I would say, an important gap in the sporting history of New Zealand. My name is Nick Yates, and I'm a Senior Interpretive Planner at Auckland Museum.
Nick's role is to work through the different ways that we can tell the story of an exhibition to our visitors.
Whether that's in labels or videos or digital experiences. Yeah, to really manaki the visitor and take them on that journey so that way they can, connect to the information that we tell. Because historically museums, have been at times quite academic and intellectual, and the idea is we want to remove some of those barriers to create accessibility to all the great stuff that we have and the stories that we want to tell.
From grassroots to the global stage, this exhibition shared lesser-known stories from the people who have shaped and supported netball in Aotearoa, from the all-important bib washers to our global champions, the Silver Ferns.
One of the unique aspects in designing this exhibition was that Netball New Zealand came to us, and they already had this rich archive of objects and documents that they could use to tell their story. So it was a bit of back and forth between figuring out what the main narrative was going to be and choosing objects to fit these stories, but then also being guided by what was in their collection and then how that would shape the story that we told. And then, of course, Netball New Zealand, they're so tapped into the wider community. And so where there was something that we knew was important to include and we didn't have any material for that, they would know the people of the organisations to contact regarding loans. So, for example, we were able to loan a whistle that was given to the first Silver Ferns coach, Myrtle Muir. We loaned that from her family, and that was a really special object to include.
Nick and Jane were part of the museum team. On the Netball New Zealand side were Dr. Margaret Henley, statistician and all-round superfan Todd Miller, and a team of netball experts who could give the full picture. Now, when you're trying to create an exhibition that tells the story of a century of our most played sport, it can feel a bit like there's a teeny bit of pressure to get it right. So, how do you get started on something like this?
The early days of exhibition development are all creative ideation in what we call the concept phase. But for me, in layman's terms, I think it's very, very based on vibes. It's a whole bunch of discussions between experts, like Margaret and Todd, and Jane being our curator and expert here as well, and myself. And together we kind of think about the really high-level story of what we're trying to tell. We think of the key, what we call learning outcomes, of we want things for people to take away, and key messages that we want to sort of put in the show. We break it down into sections, and then from there, that's when we can really use that narrative structure to break down the object list and all the other stuff that we're going to do. So it always starts with the big ideas kind of stuff. This show was, I would say, particularly object-led, because obviously that's kind of the rationale for the show in the first place, and to some extent to celebrate the centenary with these wonderful objects that were acquired by Netball New Zealand.
The collection included rulebooks, uniforms, scrapbooks, whistles, trophies, bibs, shields, and hundreds of photos spanning decades.
When going through the 100 years of photos, there were actually quite a few from around 1910, which showed netball being played in the Domain, not far from where we work here at Tamaki Paenga Hira. And seeing the outfits and the full woolen dresses and that kind of thing, and the pulley basket system to get the ball down was very entertaining and very interesting, and fascinating to see that over 100 years ago being played. So in terms of the pulley with the basket, I think that was one of the more entertaining things I discovered. That was because, as opposed to putting a hole in the basket, they wanted to use a basket, for their homework, and so they would take it, to netball practice and then back again. So the only way to get the ball out was to have a little pulley system with a rope to get the ball out of the basket. Then eventually they would have designated baskets where they cut the hole, and then it gets closer and closer to the netball basket we know today.
There's something quite moving about that historical connection to the land we're on today.
Looking looking at the place of sport in museums, I mean, it may seem like a bit of a mismatch given that sport is very active and the museum can be perceived as quite sort of static. But we look to tell stories that connect with our audiences, and sport is something that so many people have experience with as a player, as a supporter or watcher. And it's also just an opportunity to surface the stories behind the sport and to really acknowledge the people who made it what it is today. So that's not just the players, but it's the organisers, the coaches, the administrators, the unsung heroes of the sport.
What began as a game for girls played in borrowed spaces has grown into one of our most loved sports. Netball's history is one of perseverance, friendship and resourcefulness, shaped by restrictive conditions that, paradoxically, made it an accessible and inclusive game. Over 101 years, it has expanded far beyond the court, a source of national pride, a stage for some of our most beloved athletes, and a sport enjoyed worldwide. Today, every child has the opportunity to get onto the court, to play, to connect, and to carry the game forward. Who knows what the next century will hold? But just as generations before have pivoted, adapted, and invested in the game, the future of netball is safe in the hands of those who will shape the next 101 years.
I like netball because your teammates have your back.
You can really bond with a lot of kids.
I found my best friend through it. All of us have fun together. We all became friends.
I love it when I intercept the ball and get it and my team cheers me on.
I would like to play netball for the rest of my life. It would be quite a lot to be the next new generation of best netball players. That was Netball 101. Written and produced by Steph Strock and me, Laura Skerritt. Sound design by Sarah O'Brien and production support from Annabelle Walker. The executive producer was Teresa Cowie from Connect Content. Thanks to our guests, Jane Grofsky, Dr. Margaret Henley, Nick Yates and Annabelle Walker. A big shout out to the Lightning Netball team from Codyland School, and also to Howdy Hoops and Shoot Happens social clubs for letting us come along and record at their games. Finally, thanks again to Netball New Zealand for sharing 100 years of netball's history with us. To find out more about the history of netball in Aotearoa, see the links in our show notes. If you're enjoying the AMP, help others to find us by leaving a review or sharing this episode with your friends and whānau.